Welcome. Thank you for participating. If you are not using your computer speakers and microphone, please phone into the meeting using the number provided in the webinar invite. We have a lot of material to cover, so please hold your questions or type them into the chat window, and we will answer them after the presentation.
Please be aware that some slides contain examples from previous years. Keep this in mind as you navigate the process and always reference the current tax reporting year.
I'll review some tips for using GoToMeeting first. This is the newer interface for GoToMeeting, and your screen may not look exactly like this, but the controls you are likely to use will resemble the ones shown. To exit the audio while on the phone, please hang up the phone and rejoin us when you are able. This morning, we will cover changes that are new from last year and do some housekeeping regarding forms and envelopes. IRS e-services requires secure access via ID.me now. Log in today so that your credentials are ready to go when filing time comes. If you haven't registered or if there are new staff members, please do so now. The bulk of the webinar will address the data entry for the different scenarios, and we will finish up with the physical printing of the forms, distributing the printed 1095-Cs, emailing the 1095-Cs to employees who have provided consent, and we'll wrap up with the electronic filing deadlines and timeline, and of course, opportunity for questions and demonstrations at the end. These are the due dates and some links to the instructions for filing, as well as e-services and secure access. We also have a lot of information available for you in the Help Reference Library for ACA processing. The ones in orange, again, are available as hyperlinks. They're on our admins.com website. I would encourage you to print out the HR 775 document, which is the step menu process, and use it as a guide as it describes all the steps that are used during your 1095-C processing. There are 4 areas that require preparation. Make sure your credentials are up to date so you can log on to the AIR system. Running the TIN matching process. Ordering your stock and envelopes, and running your audit reports. New users must register, and all users must use ID.me to sign in now. Please do this as soon as you can, especially if you are new to the position, as it takes a while. If you already have an AIR account from last year, the only additional thing you have to do is to register for ID.me. And this is what you can expect to see when you log into the AIR system. First, you'll see a sign-in prompt, and then you will have to choose your MFA method. I've successfully used both the text and the push notifications. Then you'd either accept the push or enter a 6-digit code, and then you'll see a screen like the following. And if you do this now, you can add a roll of TIN matching if you're not already doing that, and this will give you a little bit of experience with the website today or in the next week, so that when you're ready to file, you will have become familiar with the whole process. So we recommend that you test your login credentials, which you can do today. And if you've had staff turnover, make sure you have at least 2 registered responsible agents. This is not an optional process. It's required by the IRS to avoid delays, which may prove costly if the IRS chooses to fine sites for non-compliance or late filing. You must register with the IRS to use TIN matching. You can use it throughout the course of the year as employees are hired, or whenever an employee has a name change or other change. There are 2 options. The interactive process accepts up to 25 name and TIN combination requests and returns results in real time. However, AUC has a process that will create a file needed for bulk TIN matching, which may be more efficient for you. Because the bulk file contains employees and covered individuals, from the menu, select HR, Year-End Processing, IRS TIN Matching, and on the prompt, enter the warrant check date range and specify a directory location. You'll want that to be a directory location you can access from your local PC. You can do this periodically throughout the course of the year as you update information from your employees. You might want to do this every September after the school department has onboarded new staff if that applies to your location. Luann Moore sent an email in October with details on all the year-end forms, including the 1095-C forms. The form stock and envelope have not changed since last year and will require 2 pages of 8.5 by 11 stock, printed front and back, for each employee being issued a form. The forms are set up to be sent in a number 10 standard window envelope. To see if errors exist prior to starting the ACA processing, run the audit reports available in the report library. To identify only the records that need to be corrected before a 1095-C form can be produced, select No for the Include Warnings radio button. Let's look at examples of those reports. The first report is the entity report that lists all of your entities and any errors on the entities. The second report lists bargaining units and any errors on the bargaining units. The third report lists employee errors that should be fixed on the employee maintenance screen. And the fourth report is not an error report, but rather a list of all employees that were hired, terminated, or changed positions in the filing year. These audit reports are also produced within the STEPS menu. We'll talk about that a little later. And there are links to the slides that reference them later in the presentation. After some initial setup of the entity and bargaining unit tables, along with the data maintained over the course of the year in the employee maintenance screen, run the audit reports and make any necessary corrections. Refine the data, and print and distribute forms and file with the IRS. Your last step will be to save the 1095-C forms as attachments to your employee records. This is all done via a STEPS menu that will guide the process. There are 4 screens in AUC that are used to maintain data for ACA processing to be included in the work file. We'll talk first about the employee maintenance screen, and then within the STEPS menu, we'll talk about the remaining 3. The Employee Maintenance ACA tab controls much of what is shown on the 1095-C form and is where most of the data entry will be done for ACA filing. The next 15 slides will cover these topics. Capturing data over the course of the year helps the year-end process go smoothly because you're not waiting until January to do all of your data entry. Let's review how to use the ACA tab of the Employee Maintenance screen. So who gets a form? To begin, on the Employee Maintenance ACA tab, any employee marked as reportable with dates from the current year being reported or earlier will get a form. The form will cover the employee as well as their dependents. All employees receiving an offer of coverage within the calendar year should receive a form. Even employees that are continuing coverage from the prior year and employees who have declined the coverage. It's the offer that's important for this purpose. The entity versus the bargaining unit. Note that for each employee, either the entity or the bargaining unit is used, not both. All employees by default will be set to the entity, To change it, enter a bargaining unit. It will clear out the entity. To revert, enter an entity to clear out the bargaining unit. If all of your employees are already set up with a bargaining unit or an entity from the years past, that will remain. You only need to make changes if changes have taken place. These dates should be set when onboarding a new employee or when an employee elects to take coverage. Update ACA offer start, ACA reporting start, ACA full-time start dates. If the employee was offered coverage when hired in the year being reported, use that for the ACA start dates. The covered individual dates will show the months they accepted coverage. If the employee was offered coverage years ago and this year elects to take coverage for the first time, set the ACA start dates in column 1 for January 1 of the tax year being reported. If an employee was hired and offered coverage in 2024 and did not commence coverage until 2025, those records will be included in the work file, and the individuals will show no entries on the 1095-C form for lines 17 through 30, as the coverage will not begin until 2025, but was offered in 2024. Start dates for covered individuals. If the start date is already set, as shown here, the coverage started in March of 2020. There is no need to change. The only time a coverage start date needs to be set is if a new covered individual is added, they are now reportable and accepted coverage, for example, if a spouse accepts coverage for the first time, or they had declined coverage earlier in the year and later accepted coverage this year. Let's look at the ACA end dates now. If the employee continues coverage from the prior year, leave all the ACA end dates blank. By leaving the ACA end dates blank, the system understands that coverage is for the entire year. An employee who is offered coverage but terminated or declined mid-year is still reportable. If an employee is hired after the end of the calendar year and accepts coverage to commence in 2025, those records will not be included in the work file as covered individuals with a future start date. If an existing employee with coverage has a dependent who will be electing coverage in 2025, the dependent record will not be brought into the work file. I encourage you to update employees as they are hired, even those that start after January 1, 2025, because they will not affect ACA reporting for 2024. Employees terminating mid-year should have both the ACA full-time end date and coverage end date set. The ACA full-time end date controls what data is printed on line 14, the offer of coverage, on the Edit Work File screen, and ultimately on the 1095-C printed or emailed form. Line 14 will show different values for the months employed versus the months not employed. Coverage end dates for covered individuals. Only set a coverage end date if coverage is terminating for cause in the calendar year. For example, if a spouse picks up their own insurance or a dependent ages out. If coverage continues, leave the end date blank. Leaving it blank tells the system that the coverage is in effect until the end of the year. There's a big difference between setting the stop date on the last day of November, for example, versus the first day of December. Using November 30 will produce a form that shows no coverage offered for December. Using December 1 will show that there was coverage offered in December. These examples are from calendar year 2022, but this applies nonetheless. In this case, the employment terminated on June 30. The employee record on line 18 and the dependents on line 19 and 20 show coverage January through June. The dependent that stopped coverage prior to 2023 will not appear on the form. For eligible employees declining coverage, enter a declined date. That could be the same as the offer date. It's best to use the actual decline date if it's available. Leave the coverage start and end dates blank in the covered individual section. The employee's name will be listed on line 18 on the preview screen, but not on the printed form. And notice that only their name is listed. They don't have any months of coverage checked off there. And there'll be no covered individuals at all listed on the form. What about an employee who first elected coverage in 2015, but declined in 2020, and then started coverage in 2024? ACA runs on a yearly basis, so if there are changes for the current year, make the changes in column 1. Replace the original start dates with the dates in 2024 in both the ACA dates section and the covered individual start dates, and remove the coverage end dates. Line 1 of the covered individuals is always the employee. The Social Security number and name for the employee on line number 1 will be updated on the ACA tab if the data changes on the Contact tab. Enter the date of birth for dependents for whom no Social Security number is available. For a newborn, enter the date of birth. The IRS wants one or the other. The software will take care of that, and if both are on the record, only the Social Security number will be shown on the form. Once the data entry is complete, run the ACA edit list from the employee maintenance screen to allow checking your work now against information provided from your health insurance, from your health insurer or your third-party administrator. We're still setting up. That was covering all of the employee setups, and now those are complete. And you can use the Steps menu to update the 3 ACA tables. The process always begins with the batch selection screen. This screen allows 1095C batches to be accessed by multiple users. This will allow user Wendy, for example, to create a batch, and another user, Luann, to complete the batch. A user can have multiple batches at the same time, and the previous batch need not be complete before starting a new batch. To begin, click on Create New Batch. If desired, a batch number may be entered, or the system will assign the next available number. Enter the required description when creating the batch. Having a good description will facilitate finding the batch when you return to the Steps menu. Click on OK, then select the batch and click on the Select Batch in Progress button to access the familiar Steps menu. If this is the first time accessing the Steps menu for this batch, there should be no dates, start, end, and success flags set on any of the steps. It should look blank, just like this example. Begin with the Payroll W-2 1095C step. You'll only use the Reset 1095 menu step if you need to discard all of your current data and begin again. The next button in the Steps menu accesses the ACA filing table. The TCC number will be populated from the entity table. The software ID should be the same as the one shown here. This is also the screen where you will enter receipt numbers from the IRS, which are required when submitting corrections. The second button on the 1095-C Processing Steps menu displays the Payroll W-2 1095-C table. Note that this is the second tab on this screen. If anything has changed since last year, the point of contact, street address, and phone numbers, this is where to update the information. Test this in advance of filing, especially if there has been a change in staff, personal computer, or server at your location. Check that the export file path is available to the user performing the export to the IRS. This information must be completed for each entity. Enter information common to all employees on this table. Important note, if you can, make the export location one that is available to the AUC staff as well, so that we can readily assist you. Bargaining units. The bargaining unit table, ACA tab, will override the entity table if this box is checked. Checking the box allows making entries or changing data in the boxes for lines 14 and 15. Set up the entity table first with the most common codes. Make exceptions with the bargaining unit tables. Unique employees can be handled as a separate bargaining unit for ACA purposes, or in some cases entered once the work file is built. Notice the helpful hover text that explains how to use these fields. If there are dates in columns 2, 3, or 4 of the ACA dates, the Reset Employee ACA Date step will move the dates from those columns and replace the dates in column 1 with the most recent dates. A report will be displayed showing the old and new values. If there are no employee records with dates in columns 2, 3, or 4, then the system will display a message that no employees needed to be updated. However, there may be instances where you need to leave those alone. In this instance, this employee transferred into a bargaining unit for which there were different coverage amounts. In June, the employee transferred to the DPW, and the family opted for the coverage beginning July 1. Note that the coverage end dates, each individual had declined coverage from 1999 until the end of January 2023. Leave all the dates in place to produce a form that will look like this. Notice that on lines 18 and 19 that show the months of coverage, February through June, are not checked on the form because they had ended their coverage in January and then they picked up coverage again in July. Before you can complete your ACA 1095-C filing, there are steps to run that will report on errors, make corrections, rerun reports, and repeat the cycle until those reports are error-free. And the next step in the menu is to run the audit reports. Once the data entry is complete for the Employee ACA tab, the Entity table, and the bargaining units, run these reports. It's a required step, as the Build 1095 file step will not be available until the audit reports are run. Run it without including the warnings to suppress errors that do not affect the processing for the current year. Warnings are not showstoppers, but rather informational. You can rerun the reports and include the warnings if you want to know what they are. 4 reports will be included, and all reports must be error-free prior to building the work file. Report number 4, again, is for information only. So here's a closer look at these. Report number 1 identifies any errors on the entity table. Errors must be corrected prior to printing 1095-C forms. So in the upper left, you can see that there are some errors, and then the larger illustration in the lower right shows that there are no errors on the entity tables. Report number 2 lists all the bargaining units used for ACA and indicates either no errors or lists the errors for each bargaining unit. There are 10 error conditions that will be identified on this bargaining unit audit report. Error conditions listed will give a clear message of what should be corrected. The batch number is included on all the audit reports so that you can keep track of which batch has a problem. Report number 3 lists errors from the Employee Maintenance ACA tab. This report identifies errors and provides information on what must be corrected for individual employees. Employees appearing on this report will not be included in the work file. If they should receive a form, correct the errors to bring them into the work file. If the audit report is run and set to include warnings, then errors such as employees marked as reportable set to no will be listed on the report and will not be included in the work file. Employees with a start date after December 31 of the year being reported will not be in the work file. The best practice, again, is to run the report without including the warnings in order to focus first on correcting errors. Same audit reports can also be run from the report library. We saw that in an earlier slide. And report 4 is an informational report rather than a list of errors and lists all the new hires and terminations for the reporting year. Note that employee terminations may result from promotions or transfers, so review the list with care to ensure accurate reporting of your 1095-C data. Now we will review how to handle special situations. Make edits for special situations on the 1095 work file edit screen, including changes to lines 14, 15, and 16 for one-off situations. Or remove an employee in the screen, edit their Employee Maintenance ACA tab, and add them back into the work file via the screen. We'll look at that in a few minutes. One special situation is if, for example, the police union has members who are grandfathered due to union contracts, and they may pay a different amount than employees hired at a different time. The next slide shows how to set that up. You can create a new bargaining unit for each specific information. Then set the amounts for the employee share of the lowest cost self-only plan offered to this group on the ACA tab of the bargaining unit table. Then go to the ACA tab of the employee maintenance screen and set the bargaining unit on the ACA tab only. Do not use it on the payroll tab, please. If using this code, communicate with the payroll staff that this code is needed for ACA reporting. You don't want them to inadvertently inactivate the code. If you fill in the 2G code for the safe harbor, the federal poverty line amount is required. The safe harbor code can be set on the entity table, or if the override entity box is checked, on the bargaining unit tables. The percentage is 9.5. The next slide has this year's dollar amounts. There's a lookup available to select the safe harbor code. Consult the IRS documentation and your healthcare advisor for safe harbor questions. Employers whose plan year begins after July 1, 2024 can use the 2024 federal poverty level when calculating the safe harbor. For 2023, it was $14,580 times 9.5% divided by 12 months for a total of $115.42. For 2024, it was $15,060 times 9.5% divided by 12 months equals $119.23. Another special situation might be the spouse and spouse each work for the municipality. There may be a primary subscriber and the spouse is covered under them. List the spouse as a covered individual, and on the spouse's employee ACA tab, set them as non-reportable. This is how to handle an employee with a dependent who is working for their municipality but is covered by their parent, for example. Declining then taking coverage. This could happen if an employee had been covered under a spouse, but that coverage was terminated mid-year due to an employment or other qualified status change that meets your criteria. If coverage was initially declined in the same calendar year, remove the ACA coverage declined date and set the coverage start dates on the covered individuals. The system requires that you populate line 15 if one of the listed codes is entered on line 14, either in the All 12 Months box or in any of the monthly boxes. Line 15 has the dollar amounts, the monthly costs. 1E is the most common code, and the exception on this is that if an HSA plan is in effect, you can have a 0 value in line 15. The HSA plan checkbox is available on both the entity table and any ACA bargaining units, depending on how interesting your contracts are. Line 16 shows the applicable section, and it will not show up until the Build 1095 file step is complete. You can then review it using the Edit 1095 Work File button. Make changes in this step for line 16 if you need to allow for special situations. Edits to the work file only impact the ACA forms and the electronic file submitted to the IRS. You should not do a lot of editing on this screen, but it's available for unique situations where it may be easier to just make the changes here. Review how many changes are needed, and if there are a lot, instead fix the employees or set up bargaining unit tables to cover them. Once you rebuild the work file, any edits made here are lost in this Edit 1095 work file screen. So keep track of what's been changed here. You can do that easily by running an edit list before you rebuild. Let's look at that edit list. You can run it right from this button on the Edit 1095 work file screen, and then use the list to check for new hires, terminations, different bargaining units. Especially run it if you've made changes in the work file. It will be very useful if you have to rebuild the work file. You may have already made edits to your work file and realize that you need to change data for an employee because the wrong termination date was entered or the wrong bargaining unit was set on the Employee Maintenance ACA tab. Rather than starting from scratch, you can click on the Remove Employee button, click on Yes to confirm, and enter the reason the employee was removed in the ensuing prompt. Make the changes on the Employee Maintenance Record ACA tab, and then follow the instructions on the Adding an Omitted Employee slide to bring the employee record back into the work file. Note that when adding a record this way, the audit reports 1, 2, and 3 are rerun to ensure that no errors are introduced. We'll look at that more on the next slide. So rather than starting from scratch to add an omitted employee because they should be reportable or to re-add a corrected employee, instead, go to the Employee Maintenance ACA tab and change the reportable indicator from no to yes if required, and set all the dates. Then return to the Edit 1095 work file and click on Add Employee. Enter the employee number to bring the record into the work file. When you add an employee, the system runs the audit reports to ensure that you are not introducing errors into the file. If errors are found, correct them and try again. The employee cannot be added until the errors are corrected. If needed, again, you can make edits on lines 14, 15, and 16 on this screen, which are the offer of coverage, the employee share amount, and the applicable section. Okay. All the data entry, auditing, and reporting is complete, and now it's time to provide the 1095-C forms to the employees. Create the export files and upload them to the AIR system, and attach the PDF copies of the 1095-C forms to the employee records once you get the acceptance from the IRS. There are 4 printed pages, 2 fronts and 2 backers with instructions. Fold the printed forms to show the mailing address in the window envelope. There are folding guides printed on page 4 to to help with positioning in the envelope if not using perforated stock. Most of you did this last year, but there may be a few new staff on the webinar. And AUC software creates everything you need to comply with ACA requirements. It provides your employees with 1095-C forms, either postal mailed or emailed or distributed on site, and creates the electronic submission to the IRS. For emailing 1095-C forms, there'll be no printed form produced in the Print 1095 form step for any employee consenting to receive an electronic 1095-C. There are complete instructions in HR 575 for electronic year-end forms. However, if a printed form is needed for an employee who had provided consent to receive an email, you may print a single form from the Edit 1095-C work file screen, or from the Steps menu by selecting only the employee number, or up to 9 employee numbers at a time. Once the forms are supplied to the employees, no later than February 28, 2025, give it some time in case there are corrections prior to running the Generate IRS Export Files step. The step produces 2 files, the manifest and the 1094-1095 form file, and emails the file location and names to the user generating the export. Submit the files to the IRS via the AIR website no later than March 31st, 2025. One important exception: if admins does a combined filing for you, as is done in Middletown, Connecticut, please contact admins. Do not use the Generate IRS Export File step. Since multiple 1095-C batches can be in process at the same time, be careful when generating the IRS export file. Be sure to use the same entity code or one of the entity codes specified when creating the batch. If a selection is made that does not match the entity on the batch screen, the system will display an informational message that the entity does not match what has been selected for the batch and will not create the export file. We had a glimpse of this earlier. This is what you can expect to see when you log into the AIR system. First, a sign-in prompt, then choosing the MFA method, and I have successfully used both methods, and then entering the 6-digit code or accepting the push. Then the IRS will present a screen like the following. If you attempt to log in while it's offline, the page will look like the top image. The bottom image shows the AIR filing login screen when the AIR system is available. We found that sites frequently did not return to the ACA filing table. It's way back up there on step 3. So once the file was accepted and a receipt number was provided by the IRS, you can click on this Enter Original Receipt Number step. We're hoping that it will help you. If your submission is accepted with errors, send us the file you downloaded from the IRS. We will send instructions for employee records that require the corrections. These are some sample error conditions, most of which can be avoided by using the TIN matching service. If some get by and these errors are reported, you can follow these instructions. After you make corrections, run the Generate IRS Corrections Export step. This step works the same way as the original submission and sends an email to the user with instructions for the export to be uploaded to the IRS. After submitting the file, the IRS will provide a corrected receipt ID. Please enter that in the ACA filing table. Sometimes it takes a few tries before the IRS will accept the file, and if there are errors to fix and a corrections file is submitted, click on this step to enter the corrections receipt number on the ACA filing table. We hope this new step will make it more apparent that the corrections receipt number should be entered on the table. The original receipt is in the first column, and the corrections receipt number is in the next column. If the correction is to be emailed, the email step can be used. The email step will not be required when correcting a form after it has been printed or emailed, but it will still be available if you need it. And those are corrections to forms that you're going to issue to your employees. And anytime you change the ACA data for an employee, you will need to produce that new IRS file. Your electronic file is due to the IRS by March 31st, 2025. Once the IRS has accepted the transmission, which may require corrections and resubmissions, update the ACA filing table with the acceptance number. It will be needed by the software for any future corrections or resubmissions. Then run the last step to attach copies. These are big bursting jobs and will run overnight, similar to the check copies. When you click on that Save 1095 form step, you will be presented with a series of prompts. Please read those carefully and respond to them appropriately. Reissuing a 1095-C. If you've already issued all your forms and someone calls for a replacement copy if the dog ate their homework, but you have not filed with the IRS, you may click on Print 1095 Forms again and enter just the employee number for whom you need to issue a replacement. If required, you could reprint an entire bargaining unit, for example. Or you can go to the work file screen, go to the employee number, and click on the Print Single Form button. And this is pretty nifty. If you haven't saved and archived your 1095-Cs, but the employee requests a replacement, you can provide just one with a single button on the Edit 1095 work file screen. You can print a form for one that was originally either emailed or printed, it doesn't matter. If an employee reports an error and needs a revised form, prior to filing with the IRS, edit the work file to enter the correction, then print a revised form, selecting only the employee number that was corrected. The file submitted to the IRS must match what is provided to the employee. As such, if the file is created after this correction is made, don't check that corrected box on the printed form. If the correction's made before the file is created, just write the word corrected across the top of the form as shown here. That corrected box is only checked if the correction is made after your electronic file was submitted to the IRS. If you've already filed, archived, and attached your forms, then go to the Employee Attachments tab to reprint a copy. The form may also be emailed if the employee has given prior consent per the instructions in HR 575. So that email form button will only show up if the employee is already enrolled in receiving their forms via email. It won't be available on someone who receives a printed copy. Applicable large employers have until February 28, 2025 to provide Forms 1095-C to individuals. I recommend that you supply them to employees as soon as work is complete to allow time for corrections. While these forms assist in preparing a return, the forms are not required for taxpayers to prepare and file their returns, since they can use other information about their health care coverage. They do not have to wait for Forms 1095-C to file. All AUC sites file electronically with the IRS. Especially if this is the first year working with this process, it's a good idea to test drive it. You can build the work file and spot check the resulting on-screen forms, and then send any questions to support@admins.com. So here's your to-do list. Test out your credentials with the IRS and ID.me. If you start today, you'll be in good shape to meet the deadlines. If you ordered stock last year, you may use the same stock and envelopes. The form's print format has not changed. Again, Luann sent that email. If you have not been keeping up with the data entry for your employees, start now. Test out the system and contact us with any questions.